Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the AUB Archaeological Museum. Tonight, I'm delighted and honored to be introducing on behalf of the Society of the Friends of the AUB Museum, our speaker, Mr. Nohad Schoucair. Mr. Schoucair holds a BA in Economics from the AUB and a master's degree from the Manchester School of Economics with a thesis on foreign trade problems of underdeveloped countries, as well as a diploma in economics of urban planning. He worked in the clothing manufacturing industry and in the distribution of major European brands, then devoted himself to real estate consulting in Lebanon, Great Britain, and France. He was part of several committees of various national economic associations. He served for 20 years at the Lebanese Tennis Federation. He was treasurer of the National Olympic Committee. He represented West Asia in 2 technical committees, marketing and telecoms, of the International Olympic Committee and in the organization of the Mediterranean Games. But he is also passionate about history as well as the history of ancient art. He often lectured on Alexandria, Byzantium, the Aphrodite of Cnidus, the abduction of Europe, the siege of Tyre, the Italian Renaissance, the Ottoman Empire, the 18th century European Baroque and neoclassical palaces, so on and so forth. He is also a bibliophile and a collector of old books. And last but not least, adding another string to his bow, he was elected a week ago president of the Society of the Friends of the AUB Archaeological Museum.
Again, thank you so much for being here tonight, especially with the climatic conditions, which are not very, very nice. Let me go straight, and I would like to thank very much Mrs. Panayor for an introduction that I believe is a little bit too much for me at this point in my life. Anyway, let's go to our subject. When we talk about Lebanon and its historical past, we always mention the fact that innumerable armies and greedy invaders have often plowed its soil, that empires have absorbed it, military fleets have flirted with its coasts, and that its mountain with steep slopes and high peaks has always served as a refuge for a population wary or even afraid of these martial comings and goings. A population jealous of preserving certain religious and cultural specificities, or simply of saving their skin in an aggressive environment. You know what I'm talking about these days. What we meet less, with the exception of rare contemporary cases, are detail of the historical figures who have passed through Phoenicia and Lebanon, starting with those who came there with ambitions aimed directly at this blue mountain, and going with those who have passed through our soil while pursuing larger designs. I will attempt here to review, definitely not exhaustively, we're not going to sleep here tonight, I can assure you, the list of truly international celebrities, figures who have marked their time or struck the imagination. These historical or cultural figures who inevitably magnify what they touch, what they covet, what they manage. As we will speculate very briefly on those who have made known our regions, but with no irrefutable proof of it in history. Please allow me to bypass Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure, I mean, because the controversy over a visit of Christ to the village of Cana could fill dozens, if not thousands of pages, since we still do not know with certainty whether the village of the Blessed Wedding was located in the Holy Land or within the border limits of modern Lebanon. At the time, the ancient times, The North Galilee indicated an area which could at times include present-day South Lebanon. Forgive me, therefore, for omitting the greatest historical figure of all time from this article, and indulge the Lebanese pride, which wants absolutely this unique figure, the Son of God in Christian faith, to have graced our national soul, accomplishing his very first public miracle there. A miracle that only his magnificent filial love for Mary, may I remind you, forced him to perform at her sweet request, although he still wanted to be still a humble and discreet master for the next weeks and months. We start with this famous 2000 years empire in Egypt with one of the most famous pharaohs of that time, Ramses II. At that time, there were two great empires battling to control the Near East. In the north, the Hittites, in the south, the Egyptians, and they often clashed in Syria. Their most renowned battle took place in Kadesh, the name coming from a century of the goddess of beauty. Today, Tel Nabi Mend. It's located in the Homs strategic gap or passage, the only way to come from the Phoenician coast to the hinterland of Syria. Very important strategically. Remember that a few years ago, so many tough battles were fought during the Syrian rebellion in Qusair. And Qusair is Kadesh. In fact, the precise location is called Labwe, the lioness, meaning that at that time there were still lions roaming around. 3,200 years ago. You have to do it. I'm sorry. And Kadesh is probably the last great battle with chariots, because chariots proved to be too fragile in wood and wicker, soon to be replaced by cavalry. Near defeat for the Egyptians. And it ended up in a stalemate. But the pharaoh, very early on in the world history, by an astute propaganda, letters here and there to his governors, stels, turned it into a brilliant victory. A millenarium later, Lebanon witnesses the arrival of the first of the matchless conquerors, Alexander the Great. Today, I cannot speak about Alexander the Great. It would take too many hours about the siege of Tyre, Sur. But I will just point to a few things. That the Macedonian army, who reached Lebanon at that time, conducted a strenuous and protracted siege, the only one that Alexander had to cope with during his unbelievable saga. It was much more arduous than their land battles of audacious and brilliant maneuvers. Why? Why Tyre? Supposedly the Macedonian to enter Tyre and pray in its great temple. Come on. Probably, most probably, to eliminate any Persian. Does it ring a bell these days? Or allied naval base, powerfully situated behind the Greek lines. The Eastern Mediterranean was still a Persian sea. And Alexander needed to make sure that Tyre would be subdued as he charged on full throttle towards the east and the ancient heartland. Again, let me emphasize the role of the Sidonian fleet, because then you had already Phoenician splits, Lebanese petty rivalries. The Sidonian fleet helped the Greek against the people of Tyre. You know that those Phoenicians are so easily capable of felony. Anyway, during the siege of Tyre, Alexander crosses southern Lebanon, goes to Mount Hermon, our Jabal al-Sheikh. He visits a temple in a place called in Latin Banias, but not the Banias of Syria. to pray in a place where there is a very big well that feeds the Jordan River. You can imagine the importance of water already at that time. Whilst an enormous number of enslaved people and his army cut thousands of trees to build the passageway, the famous isthmus in approach of the impregnable fortress island of Tyre. And this isthmus today has made that Tyre is no more an island and a land city, has become one. Please. More. I will go 5 centuries later, then coming back. In October 208, a Roman emperor is born in Lebanon. A true emperor, not one of those that were elected for a few days before getting slain here and there. He was born in Akkar. Akkar is the real name of Akkar. It's the Arabs who changed the name. Akkar was a city with a lot of rich agricultural input. And the guy was called Aleander Severus of the Septimus Severus dynasty. He was crowned emperor in Rome at the young age of 14 because his extravagant, maybe deranged cousin, Heliogabal, was murdered by his own Praetorian guard. In fact, Alexander's mother, Julia Mamaea, is the real regent at that time and the holder of power. But they will also both be executed by the soldiers in a military camp in Germany after failing to punish the Persians, our modern day Iranian ancestors in the Orient, because of their gruesome and destructive raids on imperial Syria. Can you advance? More. Yeah. Let's go back a little after having toyed with the souvenir of these 3 emperors. Just to say that we don't know much about the other major emperors, even the ones who have decided that Baalbek would be an enormous tribute to the gods. You know that the Beka was a real reservoir of wheat, a real reservoir of water. It was also at one stage said that the Beka Valley would have been able to feed almost 3 million of the Roman Empire citizens. Can you go further ahead? So I will not linger on Hadrian or Trajan or whoever. As the pre-Christ era ends, the Lebanese coast now, the extraordinary, the fascinating, the legendary, the most famous of the sovereigns in antiquity times, Cleopatra. She was stunningly beautiful or simply a seductress. We have no image of her, maybe a few coins where the profile is really in a bad shape. But she's definitely a supremely cunning political mind. And she must have often followed our coastline on her way to Rome, to Antioch, which was a major city at that time, or even Cyprus, where some of her sisters and cousins reigned. But in 37 before Christ, she is allied with the triumvir, Mark Antony. That famous love story that almost everybody knows the details. He was the right man of Cleopatra's first love partner, Julius Caesar. Antony, who had become a major player of the empire at this point, dominates the Orient and concedes enormous chunk of his imperum to the woman who subjugates him totally, body and soul. In fact, they lived such a luxurious life that they called it une vie inimitable. Nobody would be able to match what they did one to the other at that time. Yeah, you stay, please. To answer to his critics and his enemies in Rome, particularly the foxy Octavius, who is going to become the future first emperor, Augustus, Mark Antony, a courageous, if reckless soldier, takes a very large army, more than 50,000 fighting men, and probably around 30,000 non-fighting with him on a major military campaign against, again, the Persians in Mesopotamia. But instead of sealing his positive reputation and strategy, the campaign ends in total disaster. Local treasons by the Armenian king, etc. Clumsy sieges, losing time, and of course the climate of the desert work against the Roman legions. As Antony struggles to bring back his troops across the snowy regions of Armenia, Cleopatra flies to help him with a full fleet of varied supplies and money, of course, gold, in order to salvage the dejected Romans now retreating in total disarray and suffering from hunger and cold. She arrives in Phoenicia. She carefully avoids the large harbors like Saida and Tyre with her rich naval wagons, because she's afraid that they can be vulnerable to any uprising if the locals have received news of the disaster. So she chooses to wait for her lover in a quiet cove, like in a quiet bay, a haven protected from strong winds and underwater sea currents, almost to hide. And for her numerous embarkations to be safe, because they do not carry too strong a party of real soldiers. The chronicles, and there are very few of them, very rare, never specified where this was. The only indication we have is that a nearby village is mentioned and is called Lekon Kome, which in Greek means the white mill village. Why the white mill village? Probably like in the Greek islands of today, white lime was used for houses that were near to the sea, because it makes the climate gentler. I personally joined the uncertain group of historians who favor Damour, which you can see here, as the site where Cleopatra stayed put for more than 6 weeks until an exhausted Antony finally arrived. It is said that he cried abundantly like a child when he met her, and that the queen had to make miracles with her formidable character to restore the Roman generals' forlorn spirits, an endeavor which took again weeks, almost more than the time necessary to re-equip and back into shape the Roman legions. Why Damour? Probably also because there is sweet water supply there, like today, a fertile plain, a large one, coming into the sea, and oak forests needed for the timber to repair the ships. I come here very briefly to Pliny the Elder, Caius Plinius Secundus. He was admiral and prefect of the imperial Roman fleet late in the reign of Neron and early in the name of Vespasianus. He is the author of the first known encyclopedia which reached us. It's the earliest one to survive. It's called Historia Naturalis. It's 37 volumes, which compounds an enormous quantity of scientific and varied fields of knowledge. And it remained an authority in Europe till the medieval times. He didn't invent anything, but he was a collector. And more. Yeah, I will come back to this later. Can you come back? Yeah, here. He dies tragically during the Vesuvius eruption of 79 AD, when Pompeii, Herculanum, and their environment was totally destroyed by the famous volcano. He dies at Thebes. He goes with part of his fleet, not only to save people, but also to observe the eruption from very near. And at night, he gets asphyxiated. Why is he interesting? Can you go again to the next? Yeah, because he is the one who described that Lebanon owns something unique in the Mediterranean. It's 3 promontories, the mountain that comes into the sea. you have Shikka, you have Nahr al-Kalb, and you have Naura. And this is why all the invasions, all the big armies, and the normal flow of travelers in antique times used the Beka as a passageway. Because these three promontories, ما كان في بعد تونيلات لا بشكا ولا بنهر الكلب, forbid a serious movement of troops. Thank you. Now, you know that St. Paul is maybe the major creator of the church as we know it today. Well, he spent a few days in Saida before he set sail to Rome, where he was killed almost the same week as St. Peter. Now I have to make a quick introduction about Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. He's one of the 10 first companions of the Prophet Muhammad, to whom, the 10 companions, the Prophet promised the paradise unconditionally, because they were there from the very first day. Abu Ubaidah became known because with his teeth, he extracts shards of a metal breastplate from the Prophet's cheek during a famous battle that the Muslims, in the very early days of Islam. Well, in August 636 AD, Abu Ubaidah becomes the supreme commander of the Muslim army. He conquers all of northern Syria, Homs, Aleppo, Antioch, then visits Baalbek, and also the Lebanese harbors, who have surrendered without fighting the Arab surge. Probably, Abu Ubaidah must have been the early initiation of the transformation of the temples of Baalbek into a fortress for military purposes, which explains the name of Al'a that remains in use till now. Arabs don't say the temples of Baalbek, they say Al'a. And a quick mention of the Caliph Walid ibn Abd al-Malak, the Umayyad Caliph of Damascus. He is the one who turned a very old Roman military post at Anjar into a very pleasurable oasis. And the Armenians, after the First World War, used it as a refuge. Stay here, stay here. 3 centuries later, an ultimate Christian Byzantine effort is made by emperors to win back all of Syria, which had become Muslim since the 7th century. Nicephorus Phocas succeeds briefly, reaching even Beirut with his army coming from Constantinople, Istanbul. He is followed in 975 AD by his nephew, the very handsome John Zimisces, who recaptures Antioch, Aleppo, Damascus, and Baalbek from the Abbasids, the caliphs of Baghdad. Earlier, he had become, see the picture to the right, the lover of the Empress Theophane. She was the wife of his uncle. And this glamorous and strikingly beautiful lady, she kindled, she nudged, she did everything to convince John into murdering his uncle and successfully secure the imperial throne. And she succeeded. But in a faithful twist of fate, Theophano, who had then been twice married to emperors, because she was a widow of an earlier emperor before Nicephorus, she could not ascend the throne, because the powerful patriarch of Constantinople decided that 3 marriages is too much. So he put a condition on John Zimisces. No choice. You send Theophano into exile, and you send even his daughters into exile, and very far from the capital. Let me remind you that it's very well known that when being crowned, most Byzantine emperors, among other vows, would swear, I will establish my throne on the top of Mountain Lebanon, which is not a minor thing, because the emperors, the Byzantine emperors stretched from southern Italy at one stage till Egypt. To choose Mount Lebanon as being the symbol, the flag, the jewel of their empire is interesting enough to know. Now we come to the Crusades, too long a story, you know a lot about it. Just let me talk about Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, Saladin. This tireless warrior was the most feared opponent of the Crusaders. As a child, he played for many years in the gardens and around the temple's fortress of Baalbek, because his father, who was of Kurdish origin, governed the military region in the name of the Turkish Sultan called Nur ad-Din Zinji, who was Atabek of Mosul and the Emir of Aleppo. So Salah ad-Din Ayyubi had as a backyard Baalbek between 1139 and 1146. Having become the major power in the Near East from Egypt to southern Palestine, Saladin returned to the Bekaa when he was already fully the Sultan of the whole region, and he successfully conquers all of Syria. Then he chooses to reside for 3 months in Baalbek because he enjoys its climate of all places, and he spends long, long hours of hunting around. Finally, he is betrayed by his governor, the guy who appointed. He has to take back Baalbek from this guy, Ibn al-Muqaddam. He cannot enter Beirut, that the Crusaders defend very well. He triumphs of all the major Crusaders in the famous Battle of Hattin, which the Palestinians nowadays talk a lot about. The horns of Hattin, just under Mount Hermon on the side of Lake Tiberias. And finally, his army enters Jerusalem, which has been for 2 centuries Christian. His army advances on the Lebanese coast, so he has no problem with the promontories. He avoids the impregnable stronghold of Tyre, the last city to stay with the Crusades till the end of the 13th century. And he takes Saida and Jbeil, etc., without having to fight. Richard Coeur de Lion. Please don't call him the Lionheart, for the simple reason that this King of England, though born in Oxford, mind the irony, in a manor called Woodstock, never spoke one word of English and spent only 6 months out of his 10-year reign in England. But in romantic times, Richard Coeur de Lion, for novels and poems, etc., is very well. Because his father and his mother were, in fact, great feudal lords of France. And the empire of what they call the Plantagenet, his family, owned in France much more than the French kings. So Richard Coeur de Lion, excuse me for this. He leads the Third Crusade. He comes from Cyprus, which he conquers for Europe, and where he got married in a magnificent ceremony in Nicosia. And then he sails with a powerful fleet towards St. John of Acre. What has it to do with Lebanon? He wants to recapture Acre, yani Akkar, St. John of Acre, because it's a major harbor city and it's very important for the Crusaders here. What does he do? To impress Beirut and Saida and Tyre, etc., he makes the fleet parade in front of our coast for 3 days. I don't know how can you do this with 44 or 55 vessels, but it is said that he did so. And you can imagine the noise that they did so that the populations would be terrified. What they call buxinas, horns and alfs, 3 days and nights, and banging swords on shields. That was the propaganda of that time. Can you move on? Yeah, I will not talk a lot about Saint Louis because I'm sure everybody knows about him, how he vowed to go to the Holy Land because he recovered from a serious illness, how he spent months in Tyre and Saida, how he changed the fortress in Saida, how he, learning that his mother, which was a major person in his life, when she passed away, he went back to Europe. Now, with the Mongols of Genghis Khan, disaster strikes again in the Middle East. Huge massacres, enslavement of thousands. his great nephew, Pelago, a lieutenant named Kadboga, Baalbek, anyway, a long story. But the Mongols are at the end defeated. They go back to become emperors in China. And now, in the 14th century, the beginning of the 15th, it's Turco-Mongols who are back. And they are back with a roar in the Near East because of the great Khan of Transoxiana, the infamous Timour-Lenk. He's called Timour-Lenk because in English it's the iron lame man because of his limping leg. I don't know exactly how he lost it anyway. Completing a stupendously fast conquest of Muslim territories, the Timurids take Baghdad by storm, where they massacre more than 20,000 citizens. They raise all the great cities' monuments. Remember that Baghdad was the seat of the Abbasids and so of the Muslim Empire till then. He moves on to northern Syria. He takes Aleppo in 1400. And then he wishes to visit again Baalbek. Please show me Baalbek. He goes there. Universal fascination of this place. Huh? And I want to see, he asks to see also the old cedars forests. He climbs Mount Lebanon, coming from Baalbek. He visits monasteries in the Maronite heartland, in the holy valley of An-Nubin. And imagine, he attends peacefully a Christian mass in the modest chapel of the Maronites. Ancient chronicles attribute this extraordinary event to sheikhs of the rugged Druze community, who at that time benefited from Tamerlane's favor because of their neutrality during the Syrian military campaign. And they had been protecting Christians in Mount Lebanon for the past 3 centuries. Kramaton, as we say in Arabic, he respected the monasteries, which were in fact very small places, and didn't touch them. His army moves to the coast. To me, it's an unbelievable thing that happens in history. His mounted troops on their small horses stage violent raids on Saida and Beirut, and the end of his course in Lebanon is in Ras Al Ain, which we probably have visited on the way to Naura. It's these famous wells of Solomon, which were built by the Romans in an unbelievable civil engineering feat to feed the whole region with water, with sweet water. 2 years later, Timur will eventually crush and hold captive the rising star of the Near East, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, in a formidable battle fought at Ankara in Anatolia. A battle that brings more than 100 or 200,000 fighters on both sides and a resounding victory for him. But just like the Mongols, the Timurid army turns around, goes back to their capital city, Samarkand, and are never heard of in our part of the world. Let us jump ahead many centuries. Centuries during which our Near East sleeps profoundly. It sleeps that slows considerably any human, economic, or scientific progress, because ill-used tradition and religious sclerosis envelop everything and forbid any imagination and invention. Let us get to the moment when the young French Republic sends another giant into Egypt. I'm talking, of course, about the Egyptian expedition of Napoleon Bonaparte, who is still in 1798, one among a lot of victorious French generals of the Republic. He hasn't reached the top of the state. But a very young general who has won a series of stunning, brilliant victories in Italy against the might of the Austrian Empire. Wearing the aureola of more than 26 battles won in 16 months, Bonaparte comes to Egypt with a mandate by the Paris authorities to acquire this crucial geographical country for France. They thought it was richer than it was. He came with 164 scientists, by the way. And he came to hamper the British, the arch enemies of France, maybe to block them in their way and their link to India. Again, I will not bother you with the unraveling of the famous Campagne d'Égypte. I will just remind you that what was entitled so justly, le formidable coup de pied que Bonaparte donna à l'Orient. As if He is the one who changes everything, although he stayed here less than a year and a half. That campaign was unsuccessful. Its results were stillborn for the French, but it changed everything in our stagnant swamp. After Napoleon left hastily, having humiliated the Ottoman Turks and the Mamluks, and opened the door to a new era, the least of which is the rise in Egypt of Muhammad Ali, his modern reforms, the industry of cotton, the start in Europe of that superb Egyptology science, and the interest in our world, Proche-Orient, all of this known as Orientalism, the Orientalism, and the revived idea of what will become the Suez Canal 60 years later. It was on a day, a picnic, that Napoleon said, here, we should build a canal. Anyway, the last military stage of the French foray in Palestine was a failure in front of the strategic war of Acre, against St. John of Acre. Despite Bonaparte's legendary energy, the combination of the resilience of the cruel Ahmed Pasha stopped Bonaparte and killed totally his Oriental dream. But the guy who Hegel called the very soul of the world, because he thought he was something special, reached us in Lebanon. How? During the siege, a large Turkish army descended from Damascus, led by Abdallah Pasha, in order to support Jazar from the back. They crossed the Golan and they attacked the French army from the back. Yet on the 17th of April, 1799, leaving Hegel to go and help Jean Kléber, Napoleon swept this effort and, commanding only 4,000 soldiers, routed between 20 to 35,000 Ottoman soldiers at the Battle of Mount Tabor, which you can see from Lebanon if you go to the Shrit al-Hududi, as we say. It is said that Bonaparte climbed the next day of his triumph the dome-shaped mountain covered in turpentine and cypresses, and has had a look to the dark shades of wooded Mount Lebanon, also to the blue ones of Syria, where vegetation is scarce. Coming back to the siege of Acre, Bonaparte detached 200 horsemen under the command of Captain Honoré Vial. North of the theater of military operation. In just under 11 hours, Vial reached Tyre. The Turkish garrison fled. Vial raised the French flag over the harbor, came back to Acre, and left 200 Metwellis, our modern day Shiites, who were Ottoman haters at that time, to man the place and prepare eventually to be the core, the heart of a future uprising against the Turk, to lead most Lebanese minorities, Sheikh Daher, etc. I will spare you the details. But the Shiites of Sheikh Nasur ibn Nakif, and there is a Nasur family in Beirut nowadays, promptly sold back Tyre to the Pasha of Damascus, even before the French evacuated Syria. Imagine if the French had been left in control of Tyre, and if Emir Bashir had cooperated with Bonaparte, the French power in Lebanon would have started 70 years earlier. I will go very quickly on the age of Romanticism, the age of, as I said, infatuation with Orientalism and ancient Egypt, the times when liberal and freedom ideas spread widely in the West, and for us, the times when it comes to be fashionable to make a tour of the Orient. And it supersedes what was in the 17th, 18th century, the grand tours of Italy. Of all the renowned travelers, which you know the names, Chateaubriand, Loti, Barès, Renan, etc., I only choose Alphonse de Lamartine because his colorful descriptions of our mountains and villages gave our country its literary lettre de noblesse. So he lived in Ashrafiyya on the hill, which was supposed to be a summer refuge at that time, because Beirut downtown was too stuffed atmosphere. He went to June to visit the famous Lady Stanhope. He went to Tyre, to Noura, on his way to Jerusalem. Now, two persons who did a lot for the revival of the port of Beirut and are unfairly vilified by the Lebanese are Ibrahim Pasha, the Egyptian, who defeated the Turks and almost arrived at Constantinople in the 1830s. He was the son of Muhammad Ali. He decided that Beirut should be the main port of all of Syria. And then the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid Le Rouge, they call him Le Rouge because of all the massacres of Armenians, not the massacres of the First World War, but the early massacres of the end of the 19th century. Abdul Hamid had grown in Beirut, had loved Beirut, and although you never mention it in history, and although I am not at all a friend of the Ottomans, he did a lot to Beirut. Because of a lot of colonial reasons, Abdul Hamid and the Emperor of Germany, the one who will be one of the instigators of World War, Kaiser Wilhelm II, William II, become friends and form a great alliance, which will cost very dearly to the Turks at the beginning of First World War. And at the end of October 1898, the German Emperor Wilhelm decides to pay a visit to the Holy Land and officially attend the inauguration of a Lutheran Protestant church in the sacred city. But in fact, it was like a propaganda thing to make of his journey a showcase of the new political alliance. He arrives from Istanbul in his private yacht, the Hohenzollern. He's escorted by 3 warships, one of which is Turkish. He's accompanied by the princess. It's very rare at that time. And he has an impressive retinue. But he will not be able to enjoy the view of the Jouni and Beirut bays. Bays, yes. Because the Maronite clergy has recommended to everybody to avoid lighting their homes and place lantern as a welcome on the windowsills in a respectful tribute to the imperial visitor. Why did they do that? It was requested by the Ottoman government because it was a silent protest and gesture of solidarity with France, who had lost Alsace and Lorraine to the Germans. So the imperial yacht comes into Beirut with the nice mountain and the scattered houses almost done. On the way to Damascus, he rides the new railway, which has been built by the French with the HP, Damas et Provençal. He stops for an hour in Ali as a luncheon with the governor of the mountain. At that time, the mountain is autonomous from all the wilaya of the Turks. And on the return, he makes a stop for Baalbek. Again, Baalbek. He disembarks in Alla'a, which is very near to Zahle, on the eastern side of the railway quay, because there we are in Turkey. The western side towards Zahle is Mount Lebanon, autonomous. The Turks hate it. So to be nice to the Turks, he makes a point of disembarking on the east side. Another subtlety of the eternal Lebanese complex political situation. And it should give us serious matter of thinking, even nowadays. He visits the Roman ruins. They are in terrible state. He spends a night under a tent. They built 60 tents for him and his people. And then he initiates a vast program. This is the program that brought back Baalbek to the scene in terms of archaeology. I must stop here because we are nearing the 45 minutes of time. I promised you, if you want to, I promised you to talk about the French mandate. So just let me say very quickly that Henri Gouraud, the guy who announced Le Grand Liban and who had lost his right arm in the Dardanelles campaign of the First World War, chose Beirut rather than Damascus. He is the one who, although Damascus historically is the anchor for all power in Syria and environment, he chooses Beirut as the seat of the mandate. And you know how he lived? He didn't even live at the Résidence des Pins, which we know today. He went to the cousin inside Bay. He chose a minuscule bedroom, including a simple bed, an inconspicuous Christian cross on the wall, and a tiny bedside commode, just with a picture of his mother. this is the way French generals used to rule 4 or 5 actual countries. Then comes Weygand. He is an illegitimate child. A lot of speculations have been made about his origins and genitors, and emperors, empresses, etc. But let me say that because of this and because of the Second World War, where he was not at all friend with de Gaulle, it was said, I like this phrase, he was born in utter indifference and he died in total ungratefulness, because de Gaulle refused even for Weygand to have a national funeral. But he was a very hard worker, and in 20 months he achieved in Lebanon stability, building, and economic revival that probably we haven't seen ever since. Now for de Gaulle, I'm sorry, I need another conference to talk about him in Saidbe, to talk about his young girl and how he treated her, to talk how he came back here as chef de la France Libre after the English put out the Vichy. And after that, thanks to the English, the rising spirit of national independence came through and throughout the French. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay. Hello? Any questions at this point, ladies and gentlemen? J'aimerais voir ça. J'aimerais voir ça. Super. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the museum now.
Thank you, Mr. Schoucair. Please, I invite you to our open house at the museum shop and a small reception. You're welcome.